Welcome to this free webinar organized by Doxity in collaboration with ESPOL. I'm Victoria, and on behalf of Doxity, I welcome you and thank you very much for connecting with us today and to take this fantastic opportunity to explore this fantastic team and to know this fantastic university too. We are expecting many people from many different countries, and for that reason, if you want, you can leave a greeting in the chat and write us from which country you are connecting, that we would love to know. For those who are connecting, welcome to this free webinar organized by Doxity in collaboration with ESPOL. And I ask you to be with us a few minutes for a way to the other to connect. In the meantime, if you want, you can leave a greeting in the chat and write us from which country you are connecting, that we are curious. At the end of the webinar, we will have a question and answer section where you could ask your question directly to our panel in the Q&A box or in the chat. I ask you to stay with us until the end in order to request the certificate of attendance for this webinar. Today, we have an excellent panel who comes with us today. That is Joseph Hirsam, Associate Professor in Environmental and Climate Policy, head of the Master in Climate and Sustainability Politics. Now we are going to start this free webinar entitled COP29 and the Role of International Climate Negotiation in 2024. Where do we go from here? We will explore the COP29 impact on the climate action and listen to our expert analysis and perspective on the international climate negotiation. And at the end, we are going to have a question and answer session. So you could ask your question directly to our panel by writing them in the Q&A box or in the chat. And I ask you to stay until the end in order to request the certificate of attendance for this webinar. And now, Joseph, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much, Vittoria. I will go ahead and begin to share my screen then. Okay, great. It looks like everything is set up, so I will go ahead and get started with this presentation for this webinar looking at COP29 and the role of international climate negotiations in 2024. Where do we go from here? So obviously, this is a very broad topic, and we could spend hours and hours, if not weeks, talking about it. But I've structured it in a way that we can handle this in about 30 to 40 minutes. And of course, I'm very much looking forward to your questions and answers. So I'll break it down in the following ways, just to make sure we're all kind of speaking the same language and starting from the same point of departure. I'll start with a brief background on what we mean when we're talking about climate change from an international governance, multi-level governance perspective, what our current system is doing, how it functions, and then more of a critical reflection on not only what are the important things in discussions happening right now in Baku in Azerbaijan for COP29, but also what kind of is the role going forward with COPs? What is their relevance in our ever-changing and increasingly contested geopolitical system? And at the very end, looking forward to sharing some information about our new Master of Climate and Sustainability Politics and other programs here at ESPOL and the Université Catholique de Lille in the north of France. So, of course, what is climate change and why should we care about it? We talk about climate change a lot. It comes up in the media, different newspaper articles that we're reading on social media. And it's likely one of the most pressing and important challenges collectively of our generation. And of course, is something that is really important at the international level. It's a global issue that does not respect national boundaries. So it, of course, is something that we need to think about as one global community. If we look at it from the perspective of the United Nations, which is, as we know, of our main international cooperation institutions, climate change is a change of climate that is attributed directly or indirectly to human activity that alters the composition of the global atmosphere, and that is in addition to natural climate variability observed over comparable time periods. So it's humankind's impact on the atmosphere, and that's leading to a change in our climate. I mentioned a second ago that it's really a global issue, and it's something that therefore needs to be handled really at all levels of governance, but especially globally. And that, of course, is because the pollutants that cause climate change, these greenhouse gas emissions, do not stop at national borders. So the emissions that are coming from where I am in France keep going and do not suddenly stop a couple kilometers north from here, where we have the Belgian border. What's also really important to take into consideration here is that the impacts of climate change are not felt equally around the world. We have in the global north a long history of greenhouse gas emissions, so there's a certain responsibility that goes with that, but we are not necessarily those that are on the front lines feeling the consequences of climate change, thinking particularly those in small island developing states in the Pacific Ocean, for example, whose everyday lives are being confronted by rising sea levels that can be attributed to greenhouse gas emissions coming from around the world. Also, of course, we have a very integrated and globalized economy. So the economic effects of addressing climate change are something that are going to be felt across our global economy. It's very important that we address it at a global level. And certainly the actions to protect the climate are something that speaks to a public good. A safe climate system is something that is advantageous to all of us and everyone on the planet. As I mentioned a second ago, people are feeling it at different degrees, but no party can be excluded from these benefits of addressing climate change, regardless of what they do. So it's a global public good that therefore it needs to be handled at the international level. So having talked about what climate change is, really the composition of the atmosphere being altered via greenhouse gas emissions, it's also important, we hear a lot of talk about carbon budgets and these temperature targets that we need. So there is really a great deal of consensus in the international scientific community. You may have heard of the IPCC before, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And really, scientists have identified carbon budgets that the world needs to stay within in order to limit warming to temperature. We first talked about this idea of an average of 2 degrees Celsius. Increasingly, we're looking at 1.5 degrees. And what these are thresholds associated with limiting adverse impacts of climate to lives and natural systems. So kind of trying to do the least amount of harm possible. When we talk about global warming, we're talking about increases in temperature that are going to be accompanied by increasing volatility and unpredictability in our weather systems and our climates. We've seen that here in Europe recently with some catastrophic floods in Spain. So limiting the increase of this temperature limits volatility and gives the most people the most fighting chance to have a livable future. And really, it's something where each action counts. Each 1/10 of a degree that we can limit warming to can really make a big difference. And the science is really resoundingly clear on we need to act. And there's a potential for a huge transformation to take place, which we see. I have on this slide, for example, some information on our current pathway. We see current policies around the world are pretty off track of what we're looking to have with that green line of the 1.5 degree pathway or even the 2 degree pathway. But there's a super big potential for transformation that needs to take place. We see that in energy, agriculture, industry, and transport. There's going to be there needs to be a rapid decarbonization of our societies, and we need to have qualified scientists, experts, policy subject matter experts, the generation of tomorrow ready to participate in this transformation. So we have this global problem, and that's a problem that's global, so it needs to be addressed really at the global level. And we've identified the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change as a way to address that. And I'll talk in a second about where CUPs fit within that. But it's also important to realize that as a global problem, it's not without climate change. There are some inherent issues with the way our global system functions in addressing this problem. We have a very developed divide between those countries in the global north that have more resources and have also historically contributed most to climate change, and also those countries in the global south that are in the process of developing and are often confronted with on the front lines of climate change. Also, in an international system, we have questions of sovereignty. It can be very difficult to tell a particular country what to do. Often, states, governments are responsible and autonomous over what happens within their national borders. So we have to get everyone to agree to do something, but we have to get them to also want to commit and follow through. And also, what's incredibly important today, it's often an international negotiation that is strongly influenced by geopolitical concerns. We have a lot of very powerful fossil countries that are heavily reliant on fossil fuels and in producing fossil fuels, and they do not want to necessarily lose those benefits. So we have this global system that's operating within what's called the Conference of the Parties, within the CUP. So you often hear this term CUP being thrown around on a yearly basis. COP29, of course, is currently going on in Baku in Azerbaijan. And what a CUP is it's the Conference of the Parties, and it's the supreme decision-making body of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that I mentioned a minute ago. And that's the designated institution within the UN system where parties have decided that they want to address climate change. And so a CUP is really an annual event that is prepared for. So we had CUP1 in 1995 in Berlin. Now we're at COP29 in Baku. And it's an annual event where each CUP builds off previous years. And in the intervals between CUPs, there are these what's called subsidiary bodies. So different parties to the CUP. So typically we're talking here about states, parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. What they're doing is they're providing technical work, providing evaluation and expertise on the science, the action that needs to be taken and the ways that we're going to do there to get there. While CUP every year is kind of the political high point of this negotiating system, where we see ministers coming together. Oftentimes, we often see political leaders, heads of states and governments coming together and deciding on the direction that our global system needs to take on climate. So on the one hand, it's very important on taking decisions within the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which, as I mentioned a second ago, is primarily going to be based on consensus, where every state has one voice. We have to make sure everyone wants to agree and that they're actually going to follow through with what they said. So it's important from a procedural perspective, but it's also super important from a political and societal perspective. It's an annual moment every year where there's 2 weeks where climate is on everyone's minds. People are open to hearing about climate. It's on the agenda for political leaders. So it's really a chance to get together and take stock of where we are as a global community and what we need to do to respond to this planetary crisis that we see ourselves within. And I mentioned a second ago what a COP is, and it's happening within this United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's super important to understand some of the particularities, the specificities of this UNFCCC system. And this system, which was designed in the early 1990s, is really anchored in that situation that happened then. So on the one hand, you might recall early 1990s, it's the end of the Cold War. So we had, on the one hand, kind of the global north, mainly Western Europe, and also including what was then the USSR. But also then there was the global south with these countries in development. So there's this differentiation that's made within the CUP of this idea of developed versus developing countries. And that's based on a country's status in the 1990s. So this idea of those countries that had, at the time, had the most historical contribution to emissions, but those that also have the most resources to respond and the responsibility to act on climate change. And then also those countries that are in the process of developing and industrializing, who do not necessarily have that historical responsibility, nor do they necessarily have the resources to address climate change to the same extent that developed countries have. And as part of this distinction, so this distinction between the global north and the global south, we have this principle, it's called common but differentiated responsibilities. So as I mentioned, climate change is a global problem. Everyone is responsible for combating it. But developed countries, due to their resources and history, they have a particular responsibility to kind of do more and to lead the way in this transformation. But at the same time, this categorization really took place in the 1990s. And as we know, the global situation has evolved significantly since then. We've seen the economic rise and development of China, for example. It is now a key player. So these categories may not make the most sense anymore. And that really is a key tension that we see developing within the global way, even today in 2024, that we address climate change. So we have all these countries coming together. There's that developed and developing line. But it's a really complicated situation. The UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, it's 197 parties. So pretty much everyone around the world is there from a governmental perspective. So also climate change is very, very complex. It can be very difficult to understand and to make progress, to make sure everyone has the same idea of where we're going. And as I mentioned, in our global system, it's very hard to impose things on a particular country. So these negotiations really rely on consensus, on the goodwill and the agreements of all the parties involved. That also means that nothing is agreed until everyone is happy. There are a lot of opportunities for veto points. So what we see happening is this means that with so many parties, to kind of make this function, there are a lot of coalitions within the climate governance. So countries that have a similar economic situation or geographical background coming together to share expertise, to make things a bit less complicated and increase influence. For example, if we take the example of Malta in the European Union, which is a very small country, it doesn't have a lot of voice by itself, but when it speaks within 27 members, it carries a lot more weight. So we see all these different coalitions coming together, a group of developing countries like the G77 and China, small island developing states. They have a similar economic and geographical situation. The EU, least developed countries. What I'm really trying to get at is there are a lot of different coalitions and actors that are coming together and trying to gain influence in what is already pretty complicated negotiations. So I showed this slide here not to have you focus your attention with just ideas. There's a lot of overlap based on a country's economic status, its geographical location, like the African group, for example, shared cultural heritage, and so on and so forth. It really is a really complicated situation. But at the same time, and this is what I think is really important and what I want to stress about what I think is the added value when I talk about our upcoming master's program, what I'm excited about, is this idea of climate governance goes so much more beyond just thinking about intergovernmental, international relations in states. Different groupings like non-governmental organizations, businesses, youth representatives, everyone is trying to contribute to this climate perspective, this climate challenge, and has something to bring to the table. So even within what is primarily an intergovernmental United Nations system, we have the important role for non-state actors like businesses, youth representatives, farmers, environmental NGOs, local governments, thinking about at the local level is really where we're going to have to do a lot of this action on climate. Research and independent NGOs, so universities coming and sharing their perspective. I've been privileged enough to contribute as part of our university in this group. So there really is a voice for everything: trade unions, women's, indigenous persons, even businesses are increasingly asking for more action on climate change and how they can contribute. So we see all these different actors coming together, not just at the COP, but in all these different contexts to contribute to the climate challenge. What we often see when we talk about COPs today and climate governance today is the reference is really the Paris Agreement, something that happened in 2015 at COP29, so that 21st COP Conference of the Parties. And what's important to know about this Paris Agreement is it really was the culmination of a long and complicated negotiation process where for about 20 years, governments tried to find the best way to create an agreement that on the one hand responded to the climate challenge, but on the other hand, states would actually agree to, and it was very, very challenging. So there was this realization that we need to have some sort of legally binding agreement, so something that states from a legal perspective commit themselves to, that addresses this keeping those temperature targets, that carbon budget I talked about. So this idea of increasing or limiting the global increase in temperature to well below 2 degrees, but also doing so in a way that responds to the tensions that I mentioned. So this develop divide, questions of responsibility in history, different capacities. So what's really unique about the Paris Agreement, which has kind of come to be our new framework for global climate action going forward since 2015, is this idea of creating a system where parties are required to come up with their own pledges, what's called a nationally determined contribution, in order to contribute to this 2-degree goal, well below 2 degrees, now 1.5. And this idea that countries will come up with progressively more ambitious targets. So it's more of a bottom-up system, if you will. Instead of imposing a top-down, everyone needs to contribute X, Y, or Z, it's based on your unique situation, your history, your location and capabilities, what you think you can bring to the table to help reach this global imperative for action. And this idea is then that and every 3 years, there'll be what's called this global stock take, where we take stock of what's going on in this pledging cycle, and we can all look together to see, are we collectively making progress towards the goals? What do we need to do differently? Who needs to act more? So really, the Paris Agreement is this foundation for global cooperation going forward, not only on mitigation, which is what we're talking about when we're limiting emissions to meet these carbon budgets, but also handling issues like adaptation. How do we make our current systems resilient to respond to climate change? Questions like loss and damage for those communities that are really impacted by climate change on the front line from natural disasters. How do we make sure that they are appropriately compensated for having to change their daily life? And questions like climate finance. We know there are great disparities between the global north and the global south in terms of resources. How can we make sure that everyone has the opportunity to contribute to the transformation and thrive within our system? So really, the main features of the Paris Agreement, and this kind of nicely speaks towards where we are with COPs today, is it sets out those temperature goals on risk management. We want to keep warming to well below 2 degrees. Now efforts towards 1.5, as the science is pretty clear there. And we're going to do it via a pledge-based system using these nationally determined contributions that parties are required to report every 5 years. So there's a reporting requirement. There's an expectation that everyone negotiates in good faith and participates in good faith, which we'll talk about in a minute with current geopolitics is becoming more and more challenging. But there's also transparency reporting requirements to make sure that countries are accounting for emissions in a way that is not, shall we say, dishonest or taking advantage of double counting, so to speak, making sure that everyone is kind of speaking the same language. And then the idea is that there'll be a global stock take. And we just completed the first global stock take last year with Dubai to ratchet up the level of ambition. So midway through these 5 yearly cycles, we're going to see where we are, what needs to be done, with the idea of that these scientific assessments can allow us to understand what progress needs to be made and then encourage more ambitious NDCs going forward. And as I mentioned a second ago, there's also a framework for handling issues like climate finance, loss and damage, and adaptation. And I want to, before I jump on what's happened since, also really reflect the importance that everyone has to play in this. It really seems like we have this state level system. Everything happens in these super abstract negotiations that are super technical and boring and no one cares about. But climate change really is so much broader than that. And the UNFCCC recognizes this. Non-party stakeholders, so those that really non-state level government actors, really have a key role to play. They're a key pillar in the system that we have. The UNFCCC recognizes this. The Paris Agreement calls upon cities, regions, businesses, and others to contribute to this global conversation, to transmit and share best practices, to collaborate, cities working with each other, businesses, environmental NGOs, and help share best practices. What policy options work here in Lille might be different than those that are working in Baku, or different than those that are working in Kuala Lumpur. But by having these conversations, bringing together policy experts, what can work and how can we all contribute to a better future? And really, cities, civil society, businesses, as local actors, we are not an alternative to climate governance. We are not something that exists because the global level isn't working. We're an important part of it. We all are part of this global neighborhood, this global conversation. Climate is everywhere, so our action really plays a key role. So it's this idea, really, we need to understand the global system, but also recognize how we can be change makers in our local communities and working in our own networks. So that's really the system that the Paris Agreement is in. There's this system of pledges and NDCs, so those what countries want to contribute, but also there's really this emphasis that we all have a role to play across national boundaries, this transnational angle. What's happened since the Paris Agreement? 2015 was 9 years ago. Well, recognition, of course, that we have is that 2 degrees is not good enough. That risk management target I talked about, we really need to focus on 1.5. The science is really clear that we need to do everything that we can to reach 1.5, which really corresponds with a decarbonization, net zero emissions by 2050. But really, the world keeps warming. As I showed earlier in this presentation, we're quite off track. And the consequences of climate change are being felt around the world. The climate is becoming more predictable. The sea is unpredictable, excuse me. The sea is rising. We have also seen really this push for action at local, regional, national, across border level. So this idea that everyone is becoming more and more stakeholders that are involved. And this is also happening at the same time. We see, especially with the recent election of Donald Trump in the US, potentially a lack of engagement from some key emitters and key power players in the global climate system. So with this and growing conflict around the world, we're seeing kind of the limits and the fragility of our global system to address some of these problems. But this just really goes to show you climate and sustainability is everywhere. We're feeling it now. As I showed in that first slide, we're going to need to be making lots of transformations and decisions with how we handle energy, our businesses, like thinking about the circular economy, transportation, electricity. All these things are coming up, and we're on the cusp of needing to make some really big changes. So we can't really approach anything in isolation. Climate and sustainability questions are everywhere. Whether you're a CEO trying to plan for the next 15 or 20 years, you're working at your national government or for an NGO, we're going to have to think about how we're going to be impacted by climate change, but also how we can adapt our society in a just and equitable way to respond to this challenge. So that really leads us to what's happening right now in Baku at COP29, where one of the key issues is finance. COP29 has been billed as the Finance Cup, where it's supposed to focus heavily on what's called a new global climate finance goal, so a new collective quantified goal on climate finance. So currently, developed countries have committed to providing about $100 billion annually to supporting climate mitigation and adaptation in developing countries. However, this is really not enough. It falls significantly short of what's the estimated $2.4 trillion that are required to help facilitate everyone meeting our global climate goals. So the negotiations are on what this new quantified goal will look like. Unfortunately, the negotiations have kind of stalled out with questions of equity and justice. What is the overall target? How are we going to mobilize it? How do we make sure it's equitable? I unfortunately am not super optimistic that the CUP will deliver something that responds to the challenge that's facing us. There's also this key question of loss and damage. You may have heard of something called a loss and damage fund that came up last year in Dubai at COP28. That's another critical topic here. How can we operationalize this fund? How can we make sure it is going to those who need it the most? There's been about $700 million in pledges, but again, that's not enough for many of these communities around the world that are being confronted by these challenges. There's also the question of the next round of nationally determined contributions. So countries are expected to update their NDCs before 2025. So there's a new deadline for that next level of ambition, those next levels of pledges. That this first global stock take that we had revealed that the NDCs were really off pace, and that's what I showed in that first slide. So COP29 is supposed to be an important moment to build momentum and action, but the uncertainty coming from the U.S. election, and that really I'd like to specify that that's uncertainty with the U.S. federal government. There are a lot of really important local and regional level and state level actors there who are committed to climate change. But the, shall we say, unique politics of Donald Trump kind of put into peril, or at least question, where the United Nations Framework Convention, this current system, will go from here. Of course, the system survived the first Trump presidency, and with key buy-in from all the other parties, it will certainly survive the second presidency, but it's just a question of how much time do we have, how much lost ambition. And also, so the situation with Azerbaijan and Armenia has kind of placed a cloud over the negotiations, particularly from here, from a French perspective, on some of the state-level diplomacy tensions we're seeing. This really raises the question of why do we still need these cups in 2024? I have spent the last kind of half hour talking about how we're off track, how there are tensions. So I guess the logical question is, why even bother? Well, I'm not so sure there's a better alternative. We're in a global system. Everyone has an equal voice. Consensus is the norm, and that's the system that we have to work in. The Paris Agreement responded to some of these limitations. It's a framework for the future, and we have the tools. It's just really a question of ambition and commitment. And I think cups are really, even if we go beyond just this strict negotiating sense, there are key moments where we all think about climate. It's on the agenda. People are seeing it in their Instagram feeds and on TikTok. more than they usually are. It's in the newspapers. It's a key moment to announce change, take stock of what we've done, how we can do better, hold people into accounts. Really, it's a momentum builder. It brings people together. It's the real action happens at the local level. And that's where we need to have these exchanges that bring together different NGOs from around the world, local and city governance best practices, where under this umbrella of the need to respond to the climate crisis, they can exchange best practices, build networks, and try to make the world a better place. Building this momentum, and it's really this acknowledging the global level, but trying to work through our local and national systems. And that's what I think really speaks to where hopefully our new master in climate and sustainability politics can contribute. And so what I've tried to show is climate's going to be everywhere. And what we're hoping to do with this program is preparing students to respond to the challenge. So whether you want to work in your home country's ministry or the local town hall or as a business sustainability officer, this master is going to train you to see the interrelated nature of things, the importance of viewing things from a sustainability lens, on identifying linkages to other issue areas. How can we approach development from a sustainability lens, digitalization, energy, food systems, learning to think critically, being aware of the global level, but also very much emphasizing the importance of change in our local society. So the grassroots and the global. We're going to train you to think about things from that, understanding how these global macro level power politics can shape our collective future, while also giving you practical insights into how we can create more just and sustainable futures in local communities. And how we're doing that is, of course, it's a 2-year program based in our campus here in Lille. We also include a mandatory internship as part of this, and we're opening recruitment for beginning next academic year, so fall 2025. And what really makes this program unique is our holistic transversal approach to sustainability and climate issues. So we're not just going to study global climate governance and talk about then local climate governance and approach it from a silo. No, really the idea here is we give you the tools conceptually to make sense of our society today, and then also look for these linkages. What does it mean to have a sustainable society when we're thinking about value chains, consumption, participation, justice, and then from there, really looking at the grassroots, but also global nature of climate governance. And what I'm excited to do is we do this via interactive learning. So not only having lectures, but also important class discussions and projects, working with our different partner institutions here in Lille to do on the ground, making contributions to our local community based on project-based learning. We also do study trips. So the program will have the opportunity to go to Brussels to learn not only about European climate governance, but also how NGOs and leading businesses are acting, but also then to Bonn in Germany, where there's the United Nations Climate Secretariats, which I have a photo of here. I actually accompanied some students this past June to the UN mission meeting there. We have a observer status with our university, so there's an opportunity to see what happens in reality on site. And also really just participating in things like we do negotiation simulations, science and service of society with problem-based learning, trying to tackle issues and seeing who's been involved, bringing in guest speakers. And we also have pretty small class sizes. Our masters are typically limited to about 25 students or so. So you really get the opportunity to learn and get to know your classmates and have really meaningful discussions. Climate and sustainability politics is certainly one of our masters. It's the one I'm the head of, so I'm obviously excited about it. But we also have other master's programs that also speak to these issues and are very interesting. We have a master's in multi-level governance in Europe. So we know that the EU is a complicated multi-level governance system that has a lot of different actors. It's also tries to be a global leader in climate change. So this master's really looks at how all these different levels, be it the local, national, here, France, European level, come together to steer society and respond to these challenges and also interact in our global system. And we also have a master's in international and security politics. Climate change is increasingly being recognized as a threat multiplier, is going to have really big impacts, not only on how countries' defense systems prepare and respond to kind of fight war in the future, but also climate is creating big pressures with respect to migration and displacements. So that's a way to look at climate change from that lens as well. Of course, these two masters also have a little bit broader focus. So if you're interested in looking at climate as part of these either multi-level systems or security, international and security politics, they're a great opportunity to do so as well. So with these three different masters, we kind of are really looking to create people who give you the tools, both practical and analytical, to have a further future career in a variety of settings. If it's either being, on the one hand, working for international institutions, or also local and national governments, certainly NGOs. Really, from the climate and sustainability politics perspective, what our objective is to give you the tools to be a change maker in wherever you kind of see yourself as a future career. Either a policy analyst, a sustainability officer, an NGO, local government, national government, training you to look holistically at sustainability and recognizing how our economic, social, and environmental futures are all interlinked, and how we can work so we can flourish across all of these dimensions. ESPOL is a great place to study. We have some excellent facilities here in northern France. We're a gateway to the European capitals. We're 35 minutes by train to Brussels, about an hour and a half, if I'm not mistaken, to London. Of course, Paris is about an hour away as well. So we're super well located to some key decision-making hubs within Europe. We're a very international, especially in the French landscape. We're quite unique in that at the master's level, we propose programs in English. Of course, you'll also of course, have the opportunity to take language classes in French. But the idea really is you can live in France and study in English with a very international student body that's very multicultural. And also the program instructors, the professors, were coming from around Europe, around the world, even with different backgrounds and specializations. The campus, we have excellent facilities on campus. Our university housing is available as well. There's information about all of this on our website, of course, but really all these student services are provided in the heart of the city. The city is super well connected with public transportation, everything that you would need to thrive in terms of restaurants, cultural activities. Our campus is really in the center of Lille, and it provides you with an excellent environment to do your studies. So I will stop there. Thanks very much for your attention. My colleague Gauthier can provide specific links in the chat to any of elements about this program or our approach in general. But I would just point you certainly to our new website, espol.school. So thanks very much, and I'm happy to engage in the question and answer. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Joseph, for your interesting presentation. And I've already read some questions in the Q&A box, but don't be shy and keep writing them. So the first one is about what role do not governmental organizations like NGOs play in influencing decisions at events like COP29?
Let me just make sure that's a great question. But yeah, NGOs can really play a couple of different roles. And I think it just depends on what part of the climate policy process are we're talking about here. So NGOs are super good at making sure expertise is brought to the forefront, that perspectives are being incorporated. So on the one hand, they can work within national delegations. So trying to lobby French NGOs, trying to lobby France's position, for example. At the COP themselves, they also can be very active in having protests, movements. There's also something that's called the Green Zone, which is a space where NGOs can present and interact so they can draw media attention. But also NGOs via that honeycomb thing that I was showing earlier have different constituencies. So there's the business NGOs that can speak via a representative. There's also the research NGOs, Ringo, that we're a part of, indigenous persons. They actually have the right to participate and make interventions at the COP. So directly talk to officially and interact with the negotiators.
Thank you very much. And one thing, I would like to recall the fact that in the next day you are going to receive the registration of the recording of this webinar and additional material about the ESPOL. So don't worry, because if you miss some part of Joseph's really interesting presentation, you can rewatch it. And another question is about how can developing countries better position themselves in climate negotiation to secure funding for green initiatives?
Yeah, that's an imperative point, and it's something. Unfortunately, it's a system that has a lot of constraints. And how I see it is they can provide. On the one hand, it depends on what developing countries we're talking about, but working as meaningful, well-coordinated coalitions, especially on relevant issues, can make a really big impact. We've seen, of course, we have different groups of developing countries often talking with each other and increasing their voice, and that's super important. And I think the African group is a really good example of how that works. But also, we've seen the most success in international climate negotiations when there are coalitions that bring together developed and developing countries. A really good example is something that was called the High Ambition Coalition that took place at the Paris Agreement COP29, where a group of super committed small island developing states stuck their hand out to engage with developing countries and kind of work around these tensions of mistrust oftentimes appear, and worked to come up with that 1.5 degrees that was in the Paris Agreement. So the question is really, it's diplomacy, negotiation, coalitions, and also looking for partners, either NGOs to make compelling cases, or working with other parties within the UNFCCC. So trying to work around these traditional divides and making allies on issues that count.
Thank you. Another question is, how did the COP21 address the challenge of climate justice for indigenous communities?
Well, unfortunately, that's something that the United Nations Framework Convention system has struggled with and continues to struggle with over time. We're actually having a debate on this question with my students today in a class where we're talking about things like climate justice. And there are, of course, acknowledgements of the role that in the special situation of indigenous persons, but there really is still a lot of work that needs to be done. So they have a role in the system, but the struggle for equity and acknowledging of their unique situations is something that continues today, unfortunately.
Thank you. We have also a question in the chat. That is, what about carbon tax? Should we work that this tax must be raised by justice because industrial countries still the first get emitted there?
Yeah, so carbon tax is certainly something that is being discussed within the UN system. This COP, something that's called Article 6, is in the process of finalizing that, but it's something that is real also very much important here in the European Union, where we have what's called an emissions trading system. And there's this really a question of, and I'm not sure, I can't see the question
Is in the chat.
in the
I read.
chat.
Yeah.
Just to make sure that I'm understanding. At a global level, there are really concerns about who should be paying. And we've seen, but there's also very much this risk of what's called carbon leakage. So the idea of we have all these systems emerging around the world, like in Europe, the ETS, but also China, South Korea are developing their systems, but making sure that these systems, on the one hand, people paying into these, that the carbon taxes, the income is being distributed in a way that responds to the climate challenge, and certainly those are the most vulnerable, but also it doesn't just lead to what's called carbon leakage, which is where I was going with this a second ago, and that is that this issue where emissions from some place just end up going somewhere else. So for example, Europe has an emission system on cement, so that makes it very costly for cement factories in Europe. We don't want that to lead to those emissions just being moved to India, for example. And Europe has come up with something that's called the European Union, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, but it really is raising a lot of these issues on justice. So anytime if we're going to have global systems at the level, we want to make sure on the one hand that there's questions of equity, there's not a risk of carbon leakage, and that there's a system in place so that people can't do what's called double counting by saying, I'm planting a tree here, I can take a big credit for my emissions, or a forest. So obviously that's a super brief explanation and maybe not the most thorough, but it's a really important topic at the international level and something that we're watching very, very closely.
Yes. Thank you. Another question related to the indigenous theme is how can we benefit from indigenous knowledge and ensure that our generation still harnesses wisdom from those who are gone ahead of us?
Well, I think it's a really important challenge, and it's something that we obviously need to do better. And I think the first step, and this is a step that we've been having with our students, this conversation is participation, having meaningful participation and consultation. So having venues that welcome and appreciate and are open to these perspectives, and also in a way that is not just tokenism and not just saying, oh, we've invited the indigenous people. That's great. They do their own thing. No, it's really finding ways and having them to be meaningful parts of this conversation. And I think at the international level, what's cool is we're seeing more and more acknowledgement of this with where the COPs are being held. Next year, the COP is going to be in Belém in Brazil, in the Amazon, where there's a huge amount of indigenous wisdom, and also on a very closely related environmental question of biodiversity. There was just a COP that happened in Cali in Colombia, which again, speaking to the Amazon and Latin American indigenous communities, there's an acknowledgement that they have a lot to offer, and we need to benefit from their knowledge, and they need to be included. The first step is inclusion, participation.
Yeah. Another question is, what advice would you give to someone who want to pursue a career in advocacy or lobbying on environmental issues?
Great. Yeah, this is another excellent question. And first and foremost is really to understand the topics that you're passionate about. And really understand if it's climate change, what are the key issues, who are the key actors, but also really being good at being able to analyze these issues, being able to be a concise communicator, understanding who are the actors, how can we assess what changes are necessary? Impact assessment, what changes are taking place. So really this idea of, on the one hand, having this practical knowledge of the topic, having the analytical tools in your toolbox to make sense of things. Of course, the passion is super important as well. And really just looking at who are the people that are doing the advocacy or lobbying on the environmental issues you're interested in. What has been their trajectory? So I think really having a specialized education, of course, I will say our master's helps you prepare to that because that's what I'm excited about. That's my job. But really in your community, in your context, what education you need to do, you need to have who are the key actors, who are the people that are being successful at this, and go from there. We need people who are committed and excited about this.
It's true. Thank you, Joseph. Another question is, are there any discussion about regenerative agriculture during COP29?
So there are definitely some conversations that are taking place. Last year at COP28, there was this UAE Declaration on Sustainable Agriculture. I think it was called that. So really there's this acknowledgement that regenerative agriculture, on the one hand, can contribute to our climate targets, but also is necessary and will be impacted by our changing climate. So there are discussions that happen there in terms of kind of specialized expert working groups. I participated in some of those at the preparatory negotiations I visited with our students in June, but it's not the main focus of the COP. There are also a lot of other different international organizations like the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, something called the World Food Forum, where we actually also sent some students this year for one of our master's programs. So it's a topic that's important, but it's a topic that's being approached in a lot of different areas, not just at the COP.
Thank you. Another question is it true that Donald Trump may decide to take the US out of the climate agreement? What impact would this have on the participation of other countries?
So it certainly could happen. I don't know. Yeah, may decide, I think, is definitely true based on if you look at some of the things that he has said. He, of course, withdrew the United States from the Paris Agreement back in 2017. And the US then rejoined with the arrival of Joe Biden. So yeah, it's certainly a risk. At the same time, we see a lot of key actors like the CEO of ExxonMobil, so a key fossil fuel company saying, hold on a minute, we want to stay within the Paris Agreement. It gives us some certainty of the destination we need to head in. And also he's increasingly talking, it seems, to Elon Musk, who with Tesla is very aware of the challenges and opportunities of climate change. So yeah, it could happen. The impact on the participation of other countries, looking at what happened last time, we saw a rallying of support around the system, but also it kind of lowers the level of ambition. The status quo is not needing to be ambitious, but rather just continuing to cooperate. So it could drive down ambition at a moment when we really need to have ambitious action more than others. And also the US is the second biggest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. China is the first. So if the US gone, it probably gives more power to China to set the global climate agenda, which could be counterproductive if you look at the US's current foreign policy. So yeah, the most likely answer is it will lower global ambition. But unfortunately, we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, we have to wait. Okay, so I see our last question about how can someone work with organizations like United Nations Framework Convention on climate change?
Yeah, so I think the importance is, again, they're looking for experts, so having specialized education, training, but also really having a good professional network as well. So building up your own network within your home country, maybe even looking to already do some internships with NGOs or your own national Ministry of Climate or Environment, but also looking to do UN internships, and being open and regularly applying. Yeah, there are a lot of applicants, but the more you apply, the higher chance you have, and let the passion show through, and really try to make yourself unique. There are a lot of different profiles. There's a lot of people out there who are specializing in political science in general, or international relations. Having a specialized profile gives you an added advantage.
Thank you very much, Joseph, and I would like to thank you, all the participants, for staying with us today and for the really interesting question. Now I'm going to send in the chat the link in order to get a certificate of attendance. Okay, so here we are. Perfect. And I want to recall the fact that in the next day you are going to receive the recording of the event and additional material about the Master of Legal Expo University. And thank you, everyone. And I don't know if, Joseph, do you like to share a final message to our participants?
Yeah, thanks very much for your attention. The world doesn't need pessimists. We need people who are active and passionate about this. So I encourage you to be active in your local communities, and go up from there. And we'd be more than happy to answer any questions that you have about our program, if you think that that is something that speaks to you. And best of luck in your future studies and careers, wherever that may take you.